The first attitude that I want to point out or discuss about is an attitude of love. And I think probably most of us, if not all of us, understand this. The Bible talks quite a bit about love. And we might, begin by looking at that Jesus taught the necessity of love of our fellow brethren. And I point that out over in John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35. It says, "A commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." And so, so in other words, I think the words that Christ is pointing out there is that if we have the proper love, this will identify us as Christians, that it will set us apart from other individuals out in the world. Because he says there in verse 45, he says, "By this people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So clearly, that in other words, this, if we had that proper attitude, the proper love, I guess you'd say, it will reflect upon us, and others will notice that type of love that we have. Might also point out that we have been born again so that we might love another fervently. Consider 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 22 and 23. It says, "Having purified your souls by your obedience to the truth for a sincere brotherly love, love one another earnestly from a pure heart, since you have been born again, not of perishable seed, but of imperishable, through the living and abiding word of the God." I think it's interesting here that Peter points out that we must be born again. So in other words, we had and I think we can understand where he's coming from. When it comes to the heart's the central organ, that it provides all of our essence of life. It circulates the blood and all those things. When we have a bad heart, we have an inability to live correctly. It hinders us greatly. We can't participate. Sometimes we can't participate in different activities. For the most part, can't even participate in almost life itself. And often people that have bad hearts, the remedy of that is to have a heart transplant. In other words, to do away with the old bad heart and bring in a new heart for that body to live anew, if you will. And so I think that's the same illustrated that Peter's saying here, is that prior to you becoming Christians, we had a bad heart, if you will, a bad idea of what it was to be human. But now that we've become Christians, we are to put away those bad habits, those bad attitudes that we have, and now we are to don a whole new attitude, a whole new person. And central to that whole person being a Christian is love for one another, love for God, love for Jesus. Because when we have the proper love, then those things that was once laborsome and burdensome, love will energize it to the point to where it's enjoyable to do those things. So I think that's what Peter was trying to point out there, is that through our obedience to the truth, we come to realize what it is to be a Christian and how we can repay God and one of the things that we can do is to cloak ourselves with brotherly love, to love earnestly with a pure heart. Last I have here in this section on love is, if we truly love one another, how can we not work together as we should? And again, like I said, this whole series is to focus on it, the church as a whole being able to have the proper attitudes in order to carry out the Lord's word. And so, again, it's kind of a rhetorical question. If we're not executing the work of the church correctly, then obviously we probably do not have the right attitudes towards that work. So if we love, or if we enjoy, we have enthusiasm, those type of things that along comes with love, then we should be able to execute the work of the church and the will of the Father with hardly any effort whatsoever. But that can only be done if we have the proper love towards those entities. Next, I want to point out is we need to have a attitude of cooperation. This involves a willingness to work together as God intended. And I call your attention over to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 21. Over there we read, the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head of the feet, I have no need for you. And so this idea, Paul was pointing out, illustrating the workings of the church, or the makeup of the church, kind of to the makeup of the body. We understand that no one member of the body works independently or has its own mind that's not controlled. In other words, when we start to walk, our head does not have its own will to look the opposite way of where we're going. That type of thing. So same way with the church, we should have a willingness, just as all the members in your body are coordinated to work harmoniously. We too, as a congregation, should work harmoniously, if you will, in the work of the church. We need to be able not only to work, but to work together. The cohesiveness, if you will. And I'll call a quote from Andrew Carnegie. He says, it marks a big step in a man's development when he comes to realize that other men can be called upon to help him do a better job than he can do alone. And so, and that's another aspect of cooperation, is to realize that we as individuals, there are some things that I'm just not very good at. There are some things that I'm terrible at. And so instead of trying to pursue those things myself, I have a congregation, I have a family, if you will, of like-minded people that I can call upon to whatever it may be. Maybe it's dealing with a particular burden in our lives, to seek help there, or perhaps it's just maybe I'm not very good at evangelizing the lost, but I have a friend that I want to share the gospel with. So I reach out to one of my fellow members and ask them, hey, can you come along with me? Can you give me encouragement to go do this? Can you be there with me to help share the word of God with this individual? Whatever it may be, we can think of many types of examples. But the thing is that we shouldn't. We should be willing to call upon one another, and then when called upon, we should be willing to cooperate and work with one another. And lastly, in this section I have here is where there is cooperation, there will be productivity. And so, again, as you can think, I think, Bible illustrates it as there, house cannot be, no house will stand that a house that is divided. And same way with the congregation. We shouldn't be, while we may be 20, 30 individuals, we should be 20, 30 like-minded individuals. In other words, working in a cooperative towards a common goal, to that of carrying out the mission of the congregation. Next, I want to point out that we need to have an attitude of appreciation. We need to appreciate what others are doing. And call your attention over to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 14. For the body does not consist of members, but of many members. And we just talked about that. And then compare that with 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 12 and 13, where it says, we ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Be at peace among yourselves. And so the idea, when it comes to, some people, some of us are, what would you call it? We go against authority. We have an authoritarian complex, if you will. We don't like to be told what we're doing, and I don't think that any church really functions that way, to where where people are, kind of like elementary school. The teacher says, you'll do this, you'll do that type of. We don't want to live in that environment. But with that being said, some people sometimes have issues with others that are in positions of authority, like, why can't I be there? Why is he the individual who's in the position of authority? I could do just as good a job, if not better. Those type of attitudes we don't need to have. In other words, and what this section is trying to point out is that we need to appreciate one another and appreciate one another's roles within the congregation. And then when we appreciate one another and we appreciate one another for what we're able to do, then the congregation will work more harmonious. That cooperation that we just talked about will congeal and it'll be so much better. And I have up here that the true appreciation for others will eliminate destructive criticism, gossip, and divisiveness. Just like I say, that animosity that those of you that are in the workforce, you probably know somebody within close proximity of where you work that kind of has that attitude, of, I don't know, often we say they got a chip on their shoulder, that type of thing. I know my life in the military, it was full of them. There was always somebody that knew that had something bad to say about, or this was a little disgruntled towards the commander of the organization. And there's nothing you can do about the commander of the organization. They're appointed to that position, and that's just the way it is. If you're either you are or you aren't. And so in order for you to carry out the mission of that organization, you have to appreciate those orders, have to appreciate what that individual is trying to do, and therefore you compliment them in carrying out and executing those things. In the same way when it comes to the church, we have overseers that are appointed to those positions, and then we just need to respect their positions and respect what they're trying to carry out the work of the Lord. And when we do have an appreciation for one another, we'll be able to work more harmoniously. Another quote here. This is an anonymous one. It says, expressing appreciation is like grease on the gears of a machine. It makes others do their work much better. Next, we see that we need to be submissive. Over in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, it says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. So again, and all these attitudes are one kind of feeds the other. And so one of the ways that we can get over these bad feelings that prevent us from working harmoniously, that brings the disgruntledness, is to submit to one another, to be willing to, that it doesn't matter who's in charge, that we just all have a common goal, and I can just do what I do best in supporting that. And we are to submit to those, again, in positions of leadership. And consider Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17 says, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls. As those who will give to an account, let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. And so, like I say, there's nothing to be gained by having a bad attitudes towards those that are appointed over you or those that are in a position of authority. And again, nobody reigns or rules over any one individual within the congregation. So there can't be, not everybody can be the chief of the tribe, if you will. And so, but unfortunately, in a lot of organizations, there's too many Indians, if you will. I mean, there's not enough Indians and too many chiefs trying to do things. And so that's something that we don't need within the Lord's church. We just need to learn to be submissive towards one another. Next, an attitude to be hospitable. Christians are to be hospitable. We read that over in Romans chapter 12, verse 13, where it says, contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. Interesting words that Paul used, seek to show hospitality. I think a lot of us, we don't necessarily run away from hospitality, but it's kind of like, I don't know, kind of reminds me your days in the school when, that there's a mundane task that the teacher has there. Kind of like, I can remember in elementary school going and getting the milk, for milk break. And so she would collect all the money and stuff, and then of course, somebody gets selected to go to the cafeteria and then carry back this heavy crate of milk. And I don't know too many people that really enjoy doing that. So, a lot of times when those tasks come up, people try, we need a volunteer, they start looking the other way, like, oh, well, I hope he doesn't call upon me. Well, I'll do it if I'm called upon, but I'm not going to step out there and volunteer to do it. And I think a lot of times that's how we approach hospitality. It's not that we shut our doors and we forbid others to come into our homes, but we do it almost as a last resort. Well, nobody else will do it, so I guess I'll do it, type thing. That's the wrong attitude. We see here it says, seek to show hospitality. Again, this is an attitude, or this is a thing that we do that exemplifies us from others out in the world. This is a way that we show that love. Remember, Christ said, if you show the proper love, they will know that you are followers of me. They'll know that you're a Christian. And so so in other words, instead of begrudgingly volunteering or being semi-pushed into being hospitable or having activities within the home, seek those things out. Purpose, set aside time and say, well, during these warm months, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. I'm going to have the congregation over for whatever, for Bible study on Thursday evening, or You know, I'll host the next potluck, whatever that case may be. Maybe it's just I'd just like to have everybody over for a wiener roast. Whatever you could come up with. But the point is to execute or to be hospitable, to seek that out and to do that. I put this includes both hospitality to strangers and brethren. We talked about, I believe it was in Wednesday evening Bible study that, Christ said, what good does it do to say hello to one another? Those things are to be expected. When you give a gift to a family member during Christmas, you almost know that you're going to get one back. So it's almost like you're going to buy your own gift, or it's just a gift exchange. So that's not really being hospitable, if you will. The idea, well, I'll repay just because they did this. The idea is that we do these things not to repay or just to show love. And that also extends over to strangers. Consider over there to Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17. It says, well, not 17, verse 2. And I'll just begin in there in verse 1. It says, let brotherly love continue. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing, some have unwittingly entertained angels. Of course, the Hebrew writer is referring to Abraham. No reason to believe that, there wouldn't be angels still here yet. They're just not going to identify themselves as such. But it's interesting that the Hebrew writer points that out. So we should have a willingness to extend hospitality. The last point in this section is a factor is the rapid spread of the church in the first century was the hospitality extended by the Christians. And consider John chapter 3, verses 5 through 8. It says, Beloved, it is a faithful thing you do to all your efforts for these brothers, strangers as they are, who testify to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God, for they have gone out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Therefore, we ought to support people like these, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. And we understand we could go over to Acts chapter 2 and look, clear through Acts 4. Look at the examples, that once the church began, once it spawned there on the day of Pentecost, that they extended hospitality and that they shared common meals and they shared dwellings with one another. If it wasn't for the hospitality that the early Christians gave one another, the church would have, that was one of the catalysts for the spread of the gospel. And so it's the same thing as it is today. It can also be a catalyst for continuing to spread the gospel. So we should have a willing to be to extend hospitality. Next attitude I want to talk about is warmth and friendliness. We see this expressed by those at the Church of Jerusalem, and this is getting back into the hospitality, over there in Acts chapter 2, verse 44 through 47. Over there we read, and all who believe were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all, as any had need. And day by day, attending to the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their numbers day by day those who were being saved. And so another, so obviously people were keying in on, not only but hospitality, but their overall attitude, and they would have had a warm and welcoming attitude towards one another. And I'm sure that many saw that and said, why are those people so happy? Or, why are they so loving? And that caused many others to become interested in the gospel and to become Christians themselves. And so, same way yet today, we need to have a warm heart about us when not only dealing with one another, but also those out in the world. I have my next point in this section is it continued with the saints at Antioch of Syria and those who comprised the first Gentile church. And we can read that over in Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 11, verse 27 through 30. Over there we read, "Now in these days, prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. And one of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world, and this took place in the days of Claudius. So the disciples determined everyone according to his ability to send relief to the brothers living in Judea, and they did so, sending it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul." And so during this period of famine, natural disaster, if you will, the work of the church came together and to provide for all Christians across those lands, especially there in Jerusalem. And that was done out of the warmth of their heart, out of an act of selflessness, not an act of selfishness. And so those things can continue at today. And I see it, whenever there's a natural disaster, and it's great to see brethren still do it, like when there's a hurricane. Have received many of emails where people will send money to different congregations in those areas to help relief efforts with those Christians. And so we too can still do those things today. But the idea is, in order to do those things, you have to have a warm heart. You have to have a sense of selflessness and a sense of love towards your fellow brother in order to do those things. Next is an attitude of gentleness, not harshness, but gentleness. We can also call it meek, to have a meekness or to be meek. This is especially necessary when dealing with those who are spiritually weak. And consider Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. It says, "Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted." You might be able to yell at a child and shock them into obedience when they're small, but that doesn't really work too well when we become adults, does it? And so, we should approach one another through a meek attitude. And we can define meek as being humble and gentle towards others, willing to be submissive and obedient to the Lord. In this definition, it says it is not being selfish and arrogant, loud or obnoxious. Rather, it is having a quiet but confident trust in the Lord and being willing and able to do whatever it is He commands. And so we need to have that same attitude towards one another. It is also essential when dealing with those who we oppose. And consider 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 24 through 26. And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant them repentance leading to the knowledge of the truth, and they may come to their senses and escape from the snares of the devil after being captured by him to do so. So again, correcting his opponents with gentleness. I've known too many brethren that do have a sense of arrogance about themselves when it comes to dealing with matters of the faith or people outside of the congregation. Almost have an arrogant attitude, if you will. They kind of scoff and make fun of others' belief, whether it be atheism or those who preach a perverted gospel. Being that way does not help anybody see the truth. Often that causes them to say, well, if that individual is even, if he is right, I don't want to be a part of anybody that acts like that. And so, we need to realize that, if we go about things the right way and often exuding gentleness and correction and teaching people about the gospel, the adage, get more flies with honey than you do with vinegar type thing. We just need to approach it from that aspect and remember that God gives the increase. We don't have to force anybody into obeying the gospel. We just share it with them. We share it with an attitude of humbleness and meekness, and God will give the increase. Next, I'll point out here that when it comes, and this is our last one, and this kind of a summarization of everything that we've been talking about. We need to have, as individuals, we need to have an attitude of forgiveness, forbearance, patience, and long-suffering. All these attitudes obviously overlap, and where one begins, the other one picks up. They are vital to being the whole Christian, whether it's dealing with one another or dealing with those that are lost out in the world. If we have the correct attitude, people are going to be able to identify us. Just like we talk about, Christ said, love one another, that people will recognize that you are a follower of me because of the way that you behave. And so only when we act in the correct way will people identify us as Christians. And I'll call your attention to Ephesians chapter 4, verse 2. It says, with all lowliness and gentleness, with long suffering, bear with one another in love. If we have those attitudes, the work of the church is going to prosper, and it's just going to, it's not going to be a burdensome labor, but a labor of love. If we adopt these types of attitudes. And in Ephesians chapter, that same chapter, verse 32, it says, and be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. Sometimes we have somebody does something and we have a hard time forgiving them. We just need to remember, for however much we forgive, that's how much forgiveness God is going to measure back on us. So we need to adopt the right attitude. And when we do have those right attitudes, then we'll be well on our ways to living that Christian life and executing the work of the church and carrying out the commands of the Father in heaven. So, in conclusion, the ideal attitudes make for ideal working conditions among brethren in the local congregation. In possessing those attitudes presented in this lesson will obviously help the cause of Christ in any congregation. And so that's what it is. That's what our mission is to have proper attitudes towards our fellow brethren and towards those out in the world, and carrying out those the work of the church. And I have up here that the attitudes that we have studied here will improve our relationships with God as well as ourselves, and make us useful to the master, prepared for every good work. That's what we see over there in 2 Timothy 2:21. So ask yourself, as we leave here today, as we extend the invitation, do I have, or am I developing the right kind of attitudes in order to be a successful member of this congregation? If you're suffering, or if you're perhaps having trouble